Hello, and welcome to Masters with Masters. I'm Ed Hoffman, the director of NASA's Academy for Program Project and Engineering Leadership and the host for this activity. These events bring together master practitioners and leaders who share offer their ideas and thoughts and experiences pertaining to issues and challenges facing organizations and the project community. Today, we're really fortunate to have several distinguished leaders on the issue of sustainability. First, Olga Dominguez, who is the NASA Assistant Administrator for the Office of Strategic Infrastructure. Olga has been with NASA since 1990 in many leadership positions focused around infrastructure and environmental management, and she's the Senior NASA Leader for Sustainability. Please welcome Olga Dominguez. We're also fortunate to have Michelle Moore, who's the Federal Environmental Executive for the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Michelle plays the leadership role in establishing the administration's sustainability policy and direction. Prior to her council experience, she was the Senior Vice President for Policy and Public Affairs at the U.S. Green Building Council, a nonprofit organization that develops and focuses on the LEED certification. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us. And please welcome Michelle. And Brian Nattrass is the co-founder of Sustainability Partners and a pioneer and thought leader in corporate and government sustainability. He's the co-author of several books, including Dancing with the Tiger and The Natural Step for Business. He's also launched several sustainability programs for organizations that include IKEA, Hyatt, Nike, the U.S. Army, and Marines. Thank you, Brian, for joining us.
Great to be here.
I'd like to start the discussion with your personal journeys. Everyone gets to a certain point, then you have to go through different steps. And starting with Olga, I know before NASA you were at Navy and also the state of Maryland. Mm-hmm. When did you first realize that you had this interest in the environment and sustainability and felt it was important for government?
Well, to tell you the truth, it started when I was a teenager. I'm a child of the 60s, and when you could see rats walking across Lake Erie because the water was so viscous and there was so much trash there, I figured there had to be a better way of doing things so that that couldn't happen anymore. And you could actually see the air, not something that you want. And that's what I grew up with. So then, as a teenager in high school, I began to think there has to be a different way of doing this. We have to find something that can not damage the ecosystem to the point where we were damaging it then. So for me, it started very, very early.
Right. So your personal led to that. And Michelle, you have a background in design. And when did you see the link between design and sustainability?
Very much like Olga, my interest in the environment really originated in my childhood, too. I grew up in a little town called LaGrange, Georgia, that was near the Chattahoochee River and West Point Lake. And so we were very aware of water quality issues related to city infrastructure upstream. And I really didn't have an idea about how I could marry up my interest in the environment with my professional interests until I went to work for Interface, which is Ray Anderson's company, makes carpet in LaGrange, Georgia, Troup County. And that really demonstrated to me how you could marry up an interest in entrepreneurialism with a commitment to sustainability.
All right. And Brian, you're called and you're a thought leader in terms of the area of sustainability. You've been working in environmentalism for quite a while. Your background was as a corporate lawyer. How did you get interested in sustainability and such an early level?
Well, I have to admit my life is more of a demonstration of how you can be a late adopter and still make a contribution. My early life in law practice really didn't have much impact on me around this. In fact, when I went to law school, they didn't even have a course on environmental law. So that really dates me, as you can see. And but what happened was I was asked to become chairman of Earth Day International, the global coordinating body of the Earth Day movement, in 1994 and 1995, leading up to the 25th anniversary of the Earth Day movement. And so I became the chief fundraiser and chief cheerleader for Earth Day. And traveling to many, many different countries did two things. One, basically broke my heart to see what we were doing to each other and what we were doing to every other life form on the planet. And the other thing was, though, that it really inspired me to see what we can do as humans when we have a vision for something bigger than ourselves. So I came back both inspired and saddened, and made a commitment to completely get into this field of work. And there's a bit of a joke there, Ed, because sometimes people say, well, what's the difference between being supportive and being committed? And they say, well, in getting you your breakfast of bacon and eggs, you know, the chicken was supportive, but the pig was committed. So I started Earth Day supportive, and I came back committed.
Okay. Well, I'm supportive, and but it's an interesting. One of the things that's interesting about this topic, obviously, we use this in our training and development in different activities, and many of the topics, you know, have been around for a while. Sustainability, 5 years ago, probably even 3 years ago, we wouldn't have had a lot of interest in doing this, and there were a lot of folks who, not that long ago, saw it as working against maybe the bottom line and profit. And maybe I'll continue with you, Brian. You know, exactly when did the idea, you know, become something that is, you know, seen as a benefit to organizations and maybe a competitive advantage in many ways, as you see it?
Yeah, that's interesting. There really it happened sort of in the late '80s after the Exxon Valdez disaster and the Bhopal Union Carbide cyanide disaster, when companies started realizing that they had exposure here. This is really risk management. That ushered in this whole era of green economics, where you could start seeing the link between saving on waste and saving money, and so environmental economics started developing. That became sort of the forerunner, if you want, of the sustainability movement.
Yeah, so it sounds like early problems that organizations had to deal with, and then finding that there may be an economic benefit or savings through different activities was one of the key activities. And Michelle, from the standpoint of the federal government, which is often hard to change, what, from the standpoint of some of the things that have taken place, was a way of getting started from the standpoint of getting the idea so that it is seen as something that's important, beneficial, has benefits? What do you think are some of the key things in the last number of years that has made that so important?
Well, it's certainly, from the experience that I've had, the single most important resource that the federal government has, and the single greatest inspiration to me, for sure, is the people in the federal government. I started almost 2 years ago now, and on day 3 on the job, I had the opportunity to speak at the Federal Environmental Symposium. It brought together something north of 600 professionals across the federal community to talk about this topic. And these weren't folks who had been involved for just 2 or 3 years, or just since sustainability had gotten kind of sexy in the media. It's people who'd been committed for 20 or 30 years of their career, who were real experts, and who could stand up against any experts or thought leaders in the private sector as well, and have. So I think that the federal government's efforts, and certainly since President Obama's executive order that he signed in October of 2009, EO 13514, that a lot of the early successes that we've been able to have, and certainly the great momentum that's built up behind it, are much to the credit of the extraordinary men and women who are in the federal government and who are in military service.
So building off of the efforts of others, and interest, because all of you obviously talked to early experiences and personal interest. Mm-hmm. How do you develop expertise, or how did you develop, you're all seen as I introduce you, as leaders, in sustainability in this area. How do you develop expertise in this field, which is emerging, which is developing? How did you go about that? I'll ask any of you for how did that take place? Or
well, the part of what I tell folks to do is, and I came up through environmental, is to not look at measurements but to actually look at intent. Look at what the outcome you want to achieve. And by doing that, you end up being innovative and creative. Okay. And that's one of the ways that I've been able to bring a different perspective to what it is that people need to do. When you design to an outcome instead of a metric, or when you look at what is the intent of a law or a regulation, most environmental regulations are to protect human health and the environment. Well, you can do that by doing something at the end of the pipe, but you can also do it by coming up the line and changing your process so that it becomes sustainable and you don't have to have anything goal.
Right.
So, and that's part of how, for me, it's almost like a logical, common sense activity, even though most people think I'm nuts when I say that, but to me, it's just the way my brain works. So,
yeah.
And getting other people like Brian and Michelle to work with me have been amazing, because then they bring other perspectives and other languages and ways of communication that make it wonderful.
I think that there are a couple of things that you said and that I'd want to build on out of Olga's comments, and that is it's very definitely an emerging field, and being able to solve problems as systems challenges as opposed to siloed challenges are two ideas that I think you really have to bring to the table. I mean, for myself, in terms of how I got into this field, I have a Master's of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown. So you can imagine that environmental studies weren't necessarily a part of the core curriculum there. But being committed to innovation and being an entrepreneurial thinker and being able to focus on systems issues and solving for the whole, I think are both really critical ways to engage oneself in this field.
Well, building on what my colleagues have said, one of the great things and encouraging things for young people getting into this is that there is no right way to start, that it's so systemic and so cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, that you can start at really any place in your academic career. And so as a lawyer, I immediately realized there was a serious problem here, because my friends in the business community really dismissed the environmental movement and the environmental activists. And then as I got into Earth Day, I found that the prejudice was just as bad on their side, because they demonized the business world. So I had no beef with either world, and I was saying, well, how do you get these two solitudes to speak to each other? So part of my intellectual journey in the early 90s was to engage in a PhD program where I searched for a framework that would enable these different solitudes to have a collaborative conversation. So my journey led me to Northern Europe, which was 15 or 20 years ahead of the United States, and I came to a cancer researcher there, an odd place really to find this, but a cancer researcher who, Dr. Carl-Henri Robert, who'd worked with big corporations like Volvo and Electrolux and so on, and found a methodology that supported business and achieved environmental ends. And then the other part of that from my journey, and both of these women have talked about it, is the human side, and it was real clear that yes, we can get the science and the engineering is critical, but then what's the people factor? And so I threw myself into the learning around organizational change. And there's a great source, a man by the name of Professor Everett Rogers, who wrote a book called The Innovation of Diffusion. And Innovation of Diffusion is a fabulous book. It's about technological innovation, it's about innovation in social systems, and it's really a model for a lot of the work that we're all doing.
I want to come back to, because all of you have talked about it working together, so we could get a sense of maybe how you met and how you started doing that. But it sounds like one of the key themes for expertise, developing capability, is creating a within NASA, the federal system, and industry to compare and to maybe make sure that where you're going is the right direction. And also, one of the things that, Olga, you were talking about was making it a reward for doing common sense things and innovating, as opposed to having a yardstick that if you don't measure it, you get hit. But can you talk perhaps about how did you start working together, and how does that, for the case of you all, how does that network get started?
Well, I've had the good fortune to be working in the sustainability field, primarily in the built environment, for something north of a decade now. And it is an emergent field, as you say. Innovation is very much a driver in being able to move the ball forward. And you can pretty much bet at any given time that there's somebody else who's focused on the field who is trying to solve the same problem that you're working on or has already solved it. So there is a sense of community, certainly within the profession and also among businesses and organizations that are committed to sustainability, to help to shortcut solutions so that we're not reinventing the wheel, so that we're avoiding duplication. And within the federal community, I think that's true as well. As all of the agencies move forward towards the sustainability goals that they've set for themselves and that the President has set for all of us, we have communities within this incredibly diverse organization called the federal government, the science community, which NASA is very much a leader in. Other organizations like Department of Defense that have some processes in common with NASA. So there are extraordinary opportunities to not only help based on what we have in common, but also to contribute our expertise to help our peers and colleagues to be able to do better, faster, and to accelerate their work.
Exactly. What these two folks have said is exactly what happened. When I first started to want to figure out how to bring sustainability to NASA, I actually went to Brian. This was back in 2000 or so, and said, he's written a book. He knows he's working with Nike and with a bunch of other folks. Can you come in and explain to us what sustainability is? And so I reached out to try to find someone who was actually working with communities and communication and systems and processes. And as Michelle has said, I have folks within other federal governments and other agencies within the federal government that I work with, and that we share ideas, and we help each other out. We share contracts. We do this, whatever, to actually expand and grow this. It's a community of networks that you go out because you have a problem. Someone else has solved it or has a similar one, and then you put your brain power together and you get innovative. I mean, that's one of the cool things about sustainability, is that it really creates an opportunity for innovation.
Right. Yeah, and building on these remarks, people tend to understand that there are some common problems that we're all facing as global society. And so whether it's government, it's business, we're all facing these problems, and there's a tremendous willingness to share information and work together. And what you're seeing now in industry is really quite remarkable. There's an organization right now that our clients like Nike, Starbucks, Target are involved with an organization called BICEP, like flexing the muscle. And BICEP stands for Business Innovation for Climate and Energy Policy, Innovative Climate and Energy Policy. And here's business lobbying the federal government together with NGOs to actually pass climate legislation to kind of create a level playing field for industry and for the country. And so not all industry is actually anti-climate change legislation. They're actually in support of it. So these new collaborations are coming together all over the country and around the world. It's a very, very exciting time.
Right. So the connections of individuals, of projects, of organizations, and of industry with common ideas come together to reinforce this as it emerges.
Yeah.
Sounds to be one of the common threads. We're here at the NASA headquarters auditorium, and shortly I'll go to questions for the audience that we have here. I want to ask maybe one more idea, which is, again, emerging idea. This is something we wouldn't have been talking about 5 years ago. And so how do you frame something that's totally new? How do you create a common language? How do you get to the point where there's even agreement as to what sustainability is? I would assume that would be one of the issues to deal with. And having listened to you, Olga, talk many times at our courses, you've typically linked sustainability in terms of success for the mission, and from the standpoint of risk to mission. Obviously, at NASA, a projectized place, mission is the key driver. What was the intent, or what's the idea behind that, as opposed to just the focus purely on environmental, kind of terms?
Well, I guess part of what I'm a true environmentalist down to my bones, and so for me to succeed is I have to be out of a job. So in other words, everyone has to be within the agency, has to understand this, and so I had to learn the language of my customer, which are the missions. They didn't want to or understand my language at all. So I learned their language, and theirs is a language of risk. Risk is cost, schedule, and technical performance. And so when I finally got that through my head and began to speak to the missions as to the risk that they were facing because of some of these environmental things, like Freon that was banned, for example. Well, Freon was a major element for our foam, for the, for our spaceships, for the shuttle. And so, well, foam wasn't available, Freon wasn't available anymore. We had to get, exceptions even for the for the substitute, H141B. So, and now, for example, a risk that we're facing right now is rare earth minerals. A lot of folks are sitting there going, well, just make it for me, Olga. Well, I can't make a rare earth mineral, and they're all in China, and China can control export. And so it's a real risk to the mission. If they need a rare earth mineral for their production, the rocket, for the material, I can't produce it. It's not manufacturable. So that's a risk that's coming. And so if I speak to it in those terms, versus, we're running out of rare earth minerals, an environmental problem because the earth doesn't have any more. But if I talk about it in terms of, I can't get it for you anymore, then it makes, then they understand why they should be concerned about it and why it's a risk they need to actually deal with. And then my proposal is to look at innovation and sustainability in your design so that you don't have to use those rare earth minerals,
right,
or that you can recycle, reuse them, not
so
have
it's a key issue, obviously, if we're going to continue to have missions and be successful, and talking that language is much more successful.
I could communicate.
Yeah, right. What were some of the early challenges? What did you see as the key challenges early on in terms of, I remember years ago we would talk about some of the strategies. What do you think was the key, some of the key challenges that you faced and perhaps still face?
Well, it's again, probably the key challenge is language. It's how to communicate, how to get the importance across to the program and project managers. The younger generation is, this is bread and butter to them, but again, most of NASA is not run by the younger generation, not yet. And so part of it is getting that language of communication, to have people understand that doing it the same way it was been done for the past 10, 15, 20, 50 years is the right way. And that is probably the biggest challenge. Once people understand, it's embraced. It's amazing. It's even the most adamant opposers to sustainability. Once I was able to communicate, they became advocates for the process. So it's again, it's figuring out how to get folks to understand what it is you're trying to say and why it should matter to them.
Right. So the power of language, of stories, having a shared definition, common language would be the, the key driver. And Michelle, it has to be even more amplified because it would be tough enough to within any agency, but you're spanning the federal boundary. What are some of the key challenges or issues that you face?
I think at a federal government level, or if you're thinking about it in the context of an agency, implementing sustainability goals, as you get going, can become an organizational change management issue, because you're addressing systems, not silos. And in some cases, you are introducing a new vocabulary into the way that you're managing to mission. Now, one of the things that the executive order does as well is it recognizes that it's not a one-size-fits-all government. While to paraphrase, sort of identifying sustainability as the ability to meet the needs of today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, that has to be viewed in light of an organization's mission. NASA is going to have a very different way to operationalize sustainability in the context of what it does than Department of Defense might, which primarily sees it as an energy security challenge. Or the Environmental Protection Agency or Department of Energy, who have some level of sustainability from an environmental or energy perspective really baked into their name, right? Or General Services Administration, which is administrative and thinks about sustainability in the context of buildings and purchasing. So once you get on that path and you have a statement and an understanding of, okay, how is focusing on this set of goals that I'm calling sustainability going to help me to meet my mission better? Going to help me to address my organization's bottom line, whether you measure that in mission terms or, in many cases, in cost savings as well, or cost avoided, like the example that Olga used, addressing the design of a system before you have a waste management or pollution problem at the end of the pipe that you have to control. At that point, when you begin seeing some real concrete deliverables, some projects, stuff that you can see or take a picture of or tell a story about, then it makes what can seem like a very a very intellectual, idea of sustainability become very practical and approachable and something that larger teams of people can participate in an organization.
Right. So it sounds, again, like it's coming up to the common theme of, one, working with people at different locations with different missions, being able to adapt, the right solutions, the right environment, and being aware of the systems factors.
It's not all warm and fuzzy stuff. There's an element of it too that's, you got to have a goal. If you're not keeping score, you're not playing the game. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so for the federal government overall, we have very specific targets that we're working towards that the agencies have set for themselves. And having that common mission to meet those overarching performance goals with flexibility for the agencies to come up with appropriate strategies within the context of what it is that they do, what they're responsible for delivering for the American people. And that gives us a way forward and a way to build community around specific solution sets.
Good. Let me see if we have, at this point, questions from some of the folks in the audience here. We have a question.
Oh, hi, I'm Harry from NASA. With some of your sustainability goals that you have, what kind of changes do you think the federal workforce, in terms of personnel and institutions, would see? For example, will we see more telecommuting in the future or things like that?
There are definitely some common strategies that agencies are adopting, and I think some really great connections with other management initiatives that are coming out of the Office of Management and Budget, for instance. A good example is telework and also telepresence and other tools to enable us to connect remotely without having to jump on an airplane. I think you see some other, what you would imagine would be just tremendously simple solutions that can be challenging to implement. As it relates to green IT, for instance, thinking differently about the way that we're building out network and data centers, or even simpler than that from a federal workforce perspective, being able to turn your computer off at night without having to leave it on in perpetuity so your IT guys can update the security software when you're not. And if you think about where the federal footprint is, how we manage and operate our assets, like our buildings, and how we as federal employees who come to work every day interact in that environment is going to be really critical as well. How are we using energy? Are we thinking about daylight as a resource? And yes, as simple as it is, recycling is a big piece of this as well. We've got waste reduction goals of 50% diversion. And not only as individuals, making sure that we participate in what's a very simple process, but also making sure that there's follow-through on the back end. I know, we have all heard stories from colleagues in the private sector too, where you wonder if that little blue bin really goes to the recycler at the end of the night, or if somebody just dumps it into the big trash can and hauls it away. Follow-through, implementation, critically important. And when you think about, again, sort of us as a federal community, there are nearly 2 million of us civilians and around 1.5 million men and women in service. So even the smallest things that we do to get engaged really, really add up and make a difference in terms of the aggregate metric. And with an organization like NASA, who's responsible for science and innovation that helps to drive the whole country forward, there's an even greater mission connection somewhere like here.
Other questions?
NASA's strength is in
and its reputation is in science and engineering and innovation. How do you leverage the science to apply it to sustainability and the mission of our agency?
Well, right now we're actually partnering with the Earth Science Mission Directorate in obtaining the information on climate change at a local level, so that we can begin to measure the risk of that climate change that it will have to our infrastructure and our missions, and then begin to adapt to it. And we're incorporating that requirement into the policies of the agency, into master planning, into construction, into buildings, and so that we won't build anything today that in 15 or 20 years we'd have to modify to adapt to a change in environment. We're going to build it today to meet that future climate and that future environment that we're going to be dealing with. And so we're actually directly taking the science from the Earth Science Mission Directorate and working with Dr. Kay to actually make all of this happen for us. And the centers are very receptive. We have groups at all of the centers, and it's really wonderful to see how it's going forward.
If I can add to that too, Olga, I think that there's an element to which NASA's science mission really inspires as well. And I know as a little kid, my dad is a PhD physicist, and he was a researcher at a university that worked on the space shuttle program. And every year when we had show and tell, I would trot my dad out with real space shuttle tiles that had been to space. And it would completely awe and engage every single little kid from, I think, first grade on to fourth grade or something. But where NASA applies its scientific integrity and the scientific mission even to solving its own sustainability challenges as it relates to climate change, as it relates to materials availability, for instance, is a challenge within sustainability. There's an element of that NASA story which I think is also much more broadly inspirational to the community at large, as well as potentially solving some technical challenges that may be critical for industry as well. Like if you think about the rare earths, that's a challenge for clean energy industries. We've heard that from solar folks particularly, and given the commitment to make sure that America is a leader in clean energy innovation, that's part of how we win the future. NASA's challenge applies to a broader challenge for American industry as well.
And I might, as a voice of industry, add something else there, that I think oftentimes people at NASA forget just how well respected NASA is in the country generally and around the world. And every now and again I'll mention NASA in a lecture or talk about some of the work that we've done together. And I am always amazed, and people come up in the audience afterwards, and there is just a huge reservoir of goodwill and a belief in the integrity of NASA and the integrity of NASA's data. And you should never, ever forget that. And so for those of us that believe we're, as a society, we're in somewhat of a difficult period, then the data that's coming from NASA and the earth sciences that are coming from NASA are just critically important, to the credibility of the whole sustainability movement, and also to help motivate population. And you can be so proud of the work you do, because it is for the world.
We'll go back to the audience for some questions. One of the things you've all talked about is this is all about change, and change requires obviously leadership. And perhaps Brian, you can give a sense of, should the public sector or the private sector be providing leadership in this area? Do you see observable differences in how organizations, if they're in industry or if they're in government, go about this? Any thoughts about the leadership question?
That's no small questions, Ed. Yeah. It's very interesting. I have thought a lot about it. I've worked in all three sectors. And, when you look at the data coming out of Goddard and other parts of NASA, you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I mean, climate change is real. We've got some serious issues. And the Department of Defense came out in 2007 with a 80-page document that I encourage anyone to read, and it's called National Defense and Climate Change. And it makes compelling reading. And so given the nature of the issues, I personally believe that the government, the United States government and governments around the world, need to be the leaders in this field. I mean, there's research and development, there's policy, and then, of course, what Michelle's doing around leading by example. I mean, it's critical. I spend most of my time working with industry. And industry is in a very strange place right now because we have created a consumer culture, right? We produce thousands and thousands and billions of pounds of material every year that winds up on the waste dumps. So we've created this take, make, waste society. And so if we're going to be a sustainable society, we really have to re-envision this. And so I have a common mentor, Ray Anderson, at Interface, with a dream of becoming the world's first regenerative company. And just recently, in fact last month, Nike, after 12 years of working together in this field of sustainability, Nike has put a stake in the sand called Nike Better World. And it's phenomenal. After 12 years of working on product, I encourage anyone to look at this website, NikeBetterWorld.com. Here is a major brand that is saying we get it, and we are moving towards sustainability. We want to be part of the solution. So they can handle the sort of the material flows, and then on the NGO side, I mean, of course, they call us all to task. I mean, they're calling for radical transparency in our world today, and that's what I see their role. So, in the end, we're learning to collaborate. I mentioned that collaborative issue earlier around the organization BICEP. So all of us are learning to listen to each other, not demonize, not dismiss, and collaborate. And I think that's where the future is.
If I can just add one thing too, it's more related to individual leadership. Clearly from a federal government perspective, the president's challenged us all to lead by example. Really step up and practice what we preach. But to Olga's point, there are a lot of young leaders who are coming into not only NASA but into federal agencies across the board. And particularly coming from a generation where sustainability, environment, and clean energy is very much part of what you learn in school. What you carry with you. That this is an extraordinary opportunity for young leaders in the federal government at large to really step up and play a really important leadership role for institutions as well. Whether we're talking about projects or facilities or agency vision, or other bigger ideas, there's a real need to open the doors and welcome our young leadership into this arena.
And to those young leaders, be persistent. Don't take no for an answer. It's what I tell folks all the time is if someone tells you no to something that's just a plain good idea and common sense, repackage it and represent it, because it's be persistent and don't take no. No is not an acceptable answer when when it comes to sustainability or something that's so commonsensical as this whole activity is.
Well, last year in October when we presented the Green Gov Presidential Awards, there was actually a woman named Anna Jones Crabtree from USDA, I believe, out in Colorado. And one of the ways in which she described herself as the recipient of the Sustainability Hero Award was as a pest with a smile. And I think that's a great example of sometimes the kind of persistence it takes to get a really great idea done when it requires people to change the way they think a little bit.
Yeah, another skill, being a pest with
a smile.
With a smile. It makes me wonder, again, because of the changes, some of the things, you've worked with organizations that see it and are starting to do it, and with people who see it. Is there a time where the story shifts so that people see this as an imperative, or organizations say, I have to do this? I mean, you particularly work with a lot of organizations, efforts, they put funding, resources into it. Is there a story shift that you see with people or organizations that say, we're going to do this? And if so, when does that happen, or how does that happen?
I think that, in the federal context, as it relates to our goals around energy performance, our goals around greenhouse gas pollution reduction, as the federal government, there's some really important statistics to understand there in terms of the real responsibility that we have, to make this an imperative and to follow through. We're the single largest energy consumer in the U.S. economy. Our energy bill in 2008 was north of $24 billion. And thinking about recapturing that cost, reducing those costs, or in our current challenging fiscal environment, where responsibility is critical to the way that we're operating as well. Recapturing those costs to be able to invest in mission, is a critical way to be thinking about these energy challenges as well, because sustainability, it's not just about environment, it's not just about the people part of the equation, but it's very much about economy as well. The President's executive order is leadership in environmental, energy, and economic performance.
And that's something that's the companies who have embraced it and are doing it, they have found that it improves their bottom line. It makes them more competitive. It makes them more effective. It creates innovation. And that's one of the most amazing things. If you really embrace it to the point where it becomes part of your culture, then it actually it pays off in ways that you didn't even dream about. Our buildings, we thought when we built green buildings, we thought we'd get a 30% better energy usage. We're finding it's more like 60%. And guess what? People like working there, so they don't take as much leave. They don't take as much sick leave, and because they get daylight. It's a whole series of unintended consequences and benefits that are actually fabulous all the way around. And so that's also one of the other things that I think why we're getting close to that tipping point, because it does actually make good business sense. It creates opportunity for innovation, and it creates opportunity for young people to be creative. And I think that's why sustainability is actually going to become part of the norm. It's not acceptable to do it the old way anymore.
And NASA's sustainability base is a great example of that in action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what's actually thrilling for me to see is that once people master the basics, and you can always start with energy, waste, and water, right? That helps organizations save money, be more efficient. But as Olga said, that spawns more innovation. And what's happening now is it's in the materials sector. And I work with a lot of manufacturing companies, and they're now going right back to the wellhead or right back to the cotton field, right back to the mine, and asking questions about, okay, well, how is this mine? What kind of reclamation are you doing? What sort of programs have you got in place? And they're looking at the complete life cycle of the product at every stage along the way, and they're finding benefits to the business. They're coming up with new materials or a cleaner way of production, less pollution, so on, and it's very what's going on. So it starts developing, as Olga said, a life of its own. The companies reach a kind of tipping point, and ultimately, for me, what I like to see is there's two indicators. One, you'll know a company is very serious about it when, number one, the sustainability is built into the strategic planning of the organization. Until it's in the strategic plans, they're still playing around with it, but they're not serious about it. And secondly, when the senior executives of the organization their personal advancement or their remuneration in the private sector is based on their performance on sustainability goals, that's when you know it's real. But what I'm seeing now is when that's embedded, it gets to tipping point, then they start realizing we're actually playing a bigger game here. This isn't just about profit and loss. This is about the future. This is about our society. This is about a bigger game than just business. And so, again, like for example, for Starbucks, they've now created this interactive website called Shared Planet, and they're inviting their customers to be part of an educational experience where they're going right back to where the coffee bean is growing and all the processes through the transportation to see how you can be part of an actual kind of a life cycle approach to coffee. And it gets very exciting.
Yeah, that's incredible. You're all talking also about success. And Olga, you mentioned a couple of times getting to the point of the tipping point. So maybe the question is, how will you know at NASA, or from your standpoint, when we're at what you would consider to be a success point on sustainability? Do you have things that you look for or goals that you're shooting?
I've always said, as a caveat, when 50 years from now, NASA will have whatever materials and processes and people that it needs to actually accomplish its mission. And a way of looking at it from another perspective is our products, our rockets, our satellites, our buildings, are they flexible? Are they easy to operate and maintain? Are they efficient and effective at accomplishing the mission, and what driver? I mean, that's what sustainability is all about. It's about being flexible and easy to maintain, operate, and use. And in 50 years, if we actually, NASA still has everything it needs to be able to accomplish its mission, then at that, I know we are sustainable at that point. But, and also the other piece of it is when sustainability is just part of the way we do business. It's not a standalone thing. It's not something that has to be pushed. It's simply part of the way that it's part of the culture. It's part of what we do and how we do to achieve our missions and programs.
Right. Mission, projects, products, outcomes. Michelle, how do you look at it across the larger federal system? How do you know you're being successful? How do you know that you're getting close? Are there metrics or measures that you start to look at? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Our focus right now is implementation. It's all about putting points on the board. And the executive order that the President signed set up a series of goals and metrics for us. We're on the cusp of being able to report out with how we're doing after 1 year of progress under the OMB, Office of Management and Budget scorecards, and also what first ever federal greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So we'll be able to see in a very clear and straightforward format how we're moving forward. But I think that while we keep our eye on the ball in terms of where we want to be in 2020, based on those big picture performance metrics, we also have to stay focused on what we're delivering today. Both in terms of that annual progress report, are we seeing the change that we need in terms of waste or emissions or improvement in energy efficiency? But also, how are we tackling those tough projects? It may be something that seems relatively little in terms of the metrics, but it's a leading indicator of whether or not your agency or your facility or your project team is really taking this stuff seriously. And looking at those opportunities to show that we're thinking about what we're doing differently in terms of the outcomes and performance metrics we're driving. I think a great example is actually a project that GSA has been helping to lead on looking at our supply chain. Greening our supply chain and looking specifically at greenhouse gas emissions as a metric for that. Now, the federal government, if you're thinking about leadership by example, is also the kind of organization that could be a customer for a little entrepreneurial idea that helps turn it into a great American enterprise that's creating jobs. So how are we thinking about the way that we're purchasing equipment, the way that we're interacting with the small business community, and the way that we're supporting innovation from that perspective as well? So that's another important focus of our work right now.
Right. So hard measures as well as both short-term and long-term things that you look at.
Hard measures and project deliverables.
Right. Okay. Brian, when you're advising some leaders in industry, how do you tell them to what to look for in terms of success or outcome?
Well, it's everything that Olga and Michelle have talked about. I mean, setting the metrics, setting the goals. But I'll say two things. One is that for people really getting into this work and wanting to be successful, it is fundamental to support the mission of the organization. And it's absolutely fundamental. And when we first started working with the United States Army back in 2002, the Commandant said to me, look, the United States Army is very clear about its mission. We're here to support the United States and its allies. This base, Fort Bragg, we're here to put, train troops and put them and get them ready for battle. That's our mission. If you can show me how sustainability supports our mission and the Army's mission, we can be friends. It was that simple. And so we went out to be friends, right?
Yeah.
And we were led out to the ranges, and anybody that's been around a military base knows that being on the range is not a friendly place for human beings or most life to be. And we took on as a challenge that if sustainability principles could help rangelands become more resilient and therefore be able to train troops for battle in conditions similar to battle, and because you fight as you train, as they say, then we could make a contribution, and we did. We helped make the rangelands more resilient. So now there's a whole movement across the Army around sustainable training, sustainable rangelands, and we went step by step through different functions and looked at how could we make what you do better, right? Do it more efficiently, more holistically, and it worked real well. And so it's just basically a step-by-step business approach. But in the end, as I said, ultimately, you want these organizations to take a very systemic view of their impact on the Earth, and the Army is very good about their impact on the communities, the Army community and the neighboring communities, and so community has to be brought into it, as well as the environment, as well as the mission, and when the companies really take a holistic view, then you know you've really made progress. You know, and we're seeing that.
A lot of thoughts there in terms of that. Want to open it up one more time to the audience to see if we have any questions. Well, we're up in the back, so Ramian gets exercise.
I like the sound about implementation, but there's an ingredient necessary for that, and it's called funding. So in the current budget environment, how do you see sustainability projects faring in the future?
So I think there are a couple of thoughts on that from a federal-wide perspective. You know, one thing to keep in mind is that from the Recovery Act, you know, there was something north of $11 billion invested in federal infrastructure, you know, which included projects like $5.5 billion going to the General Services Administration, specifically to improve the energy performance and sustainability of federal facilities. But that's true in other agencies like DOD and like VA as well. You know, so we expect to see extraordinary results of what that investment will be delivering in terms of the overall performance of federal facilities and infrastructure in line with sustainability goals. Some agencies, like the Department of Defense, also have annually appropriated funds. They have something called the ESIP program, Energy Conservation and Investment Program, and it's a set-aside that's specifically appropriated to fund high return on investment, energy efficiency, and renewable projects. And it has a strong history of performance, and it's something that's been reviewed well both by OMB and by congressional appropriators. You know, but ultimately, you know, when you think about the funding context and you think about what sustainability is about as well, you know, these are measures that, particularly in the near and medium term, you know, need to have cost savings associated with them as well. You know, it's not just about doing new stuff. You know, this isn't about green bling. You know, this is about doing what we do better so that it has better outcomes. You know, just like Olga said, you know, whether we're talking about our facilities or whether we're talking about how we're designing our processes, rethinking them so that you've got the outcome that's anticipated, but so that you're eliminating risk management or waste management or other challenges that may be associated with that are ultimately going to have bigger ticket costs in many instances than just thinking about it and designing for sustainability up front.
And at NASA, since we don't have set-asides for energy or a variety of other things, part of what we've begun to do is just make it part of our policy requirements. So it's just, it has to get budgeted into the process because it's part of our requirement base. And that's the, you know, whether we have extra money or not, it's into everything that we do.
And I'd just like to mention on the private sector side, one of the most famous businessmen in Europe, one of the wealthiest men in the world, is a man called Ingvar Kamprad, and his initials are in the words IKEA, and he's worth over $20 billion now. Started in business when he was 17 years old, and he very early on got this whole idea of sustainability from Dr. Robert over in Sweden, and he said, fine, I get that, I get it. He says, you can make my product sustainable, just don't make it cost a kroner more. Right, and that's what business people are saying. Do it, fine, but just can't cost anymore. So you know, we're not looking for extra budgets. We're looking, as Michelle said, to rethink it, to do it better, to do it differently. And I think that's really the approach you're seeing.
And we have found that in our buildings, when we started building green buildings, and our policy went in place in 2003, and now it's actually, it costs us more money if we try to build the old way. It's actually, because it's become part of the requirement. It's part of what you do. So, and the A&E firms out there are all doing, you know, they can't design any other way right now. So it's kind of neat to see that happen and see that change.
Okay, I'm getting the signal. We have only a few minutes, so let me ask maybe a final question, you know, for all of you. For those who are interested in supporting, participating, you know, sustainability. How do they do that? I mean, for folks at NASA, how do people get involved in supporting this?
Well, every center has a center sustainability officer. It's in the center director's office. I am the agency's senior sustainability official. We are creating teams and across the agency to have that you can join in. And the other thing is, like I said before, be persistent. If you have a good idea about a good sustainable idea, just push it forward. Don't take no as an acceptable answer.
But definitely reach out and get involved, either in your center green team, or in some cases there are actually green teams that are cutting across agencies that are regionally focused. Because ultimately, and this was one of those things I was really surprised to learn when I came into the federal government, only about 15% of us actually work in Washington, D.C. 85% of us are somewhere else. And so what happens, not in D.C., but out in the real world, as people who live in D.C. typically say, is incredibly important, not only in terms of meeting our federal-wide metrics, but also in living up that responsibility to lead by example, and being great neighbors and being great examples in the communities that we live and operate in around the country.
Right. Again, the connections and the networks. Brian, any thoughts?
Well, as opposed to law, which has got, I think, justifies all its reputation about being stodgy and sometimes arrogant and so on, I find the sustainability community to be incredibly supportive and incredibly open and transparent and very approachable. So if you're interested in a career, I wouldn't hesitate in picking up the phone or sending an email to people. I get them all the time. And, use Facebook, use the web, find people and approach them. It's a very collaborative community.
Thank you. I want to thank you all, and thank our guest speakers and distinguished leaders. It's a topic that's fascinating because, again, several years ago we probably wouldn't have been here, and we do introductory and foundational programs for engineers and project managers. Increasingly, the folks come on board talking about this as being an essential part of what needs to happen. So I appreciate your time. I want to thank Olga and Michelle and Brian for their time and for being here. So thank you very much. I want to thank also the Office of Strategic Infrastructure, because they're always working hard with us to do these kinds of activities. And we have a great team down at Kennedy with our green engineering course right now taking place. And again, want to thank NASA TV for setting this up and helping to make this happen. So till next time, thank you, and keep learning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Hey, you should be taking over from Charlie Rose.
There you go.